Good morning. Welcome to the lecture 4 of this ongoing course on understanding and reducing greenhouse gas emissions with a focus on scope 1 and 2 emission reduction through building design and construction. I am your instructor, Professor Avlokita Agrawal, Associate Professor at Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. In the previous 3 lectures of this first week, where we are kind of trying to understand what this whole discussion is and why at all are we talking about greenhouse gas emissions in the first place, we are going over the history which we have seen in the previous 2 lectures, and in the third lecture we talked about what climate change is, how do we know that climate change is for real, and then we also saw that historically how have we started to discuss about climate change and what we are, where we are today. And then we also saw the goal 13 on climate action of SDG and also the progress on this particular goal, and the alarming thing was that we are nowhere near to the target set in goal number 13 on climate action, rather we are moving away. So, we increase the total greenhouse gas production by 6% by 2021 from setting the SDG goal 13. So, which is really disheartening and also requires for an urgent action. In this lecture, we are quickly talking about introduction to climate risk, types of climate risk and some examples of climate risk. Now, why are we talking about climate risk and after talking about climate change? So, some of you might argue that okay, climate change is happening, so what? I am staying comfortably inside my homes and I am having enough supply of food and everything. Now, we might be experiencing that because we are not part of the vulnerable group of people, of communities. We might be in a country where we are protected and safe from a lot of these impacts because of climate change, and that is important for us and for everybody. And think of it, we are sitting in India and we are not a developed country as of now like Europe and America. Now, somebody who is staying in Europe and America needs to understand the repercussion, the impact of his or her actions on the people elsewhere on planet, and that is what we were talking about when we were talking about sustainable development. It is not place bound, it is not time bound. It is very large on timeline, it is geographically, it covers the entire planet, and not just that, beyond planet also. The impact of our risks is what we were talking about in sustainable development. Now, here we have to very clearly understand that our actions and the impact of that in the form of climate change has an impact on vulnerable population. It is risky, and not just vulnerable population, at certain point of time it becomes a risk for everybody. When it is a severe climate hazard, for example hurricane or a cyclone or a typhoon, it does not discriminate between vulnerable people and not vulnerable people, people who are better off. So, it does not, the nature does not discriminate, and that is why we have to clearly understand that what are the climate risks that we might be subjected to. So, quickly, what is a climate risk? Climate risk is the potential for climate change to create adverse consequences for human or ecological systems, and this includes impacts on lives, livelihoods, health and well-being, economic, social and cultural assets and investments, infrastructure, services provision, ecosystems and species. So, we are literally covering everything. We are talking about ecosystems, we are talking about species who cannot talk for themselves, who cannot fight for themselves, like plants, the trees, the flora, the animals, a lot of animal species. We are talking about livelihoods. A lot of people, they lose their livelihood. Think about them being surviving without a livelihood. How would one be able to feed for their family, to support their families in the absence of livelihoods? A lot of depletion of social and cultural assets. So, earthquakes razing the entire historic towns is a depletion of cultural asset. social assets, and similar to that. So, literally everything can come under the umbrella of climate risk. And here if you can see, if you can look at this particular graphic, we are talking about the spectrum of this climate risk, and it covers issues, wide ranging issues, from environment to socio cultural to economic, literally everything. So, we are talking about the climate events, extreme climate events such as cyclone and storms. We are talking about extreme rainfall, heat wave, temperatures, acidification of oceans, glacier retreats, sea level rise, desertification. We are talking about land and forest degradation, we are talking about salinization, and then events such as drought, flooding, eventually leading to loss of biodiversity. Now, this is largely the environment related events that we are talking about, further taking to socio-cultural and economic aspect. Now, what does IPCC say on climate risk? It says that one of the primary goals of the IPCC, that was created by the UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, and WMO, World Meteorological Organization, is to evaluate climate risks and explore strategies for their prevention and publish this knowledge each year in a series of comprehensive reports. So, two very clear tasks. One is to evaluate the risks that are there due to climate change, the climate risks that we are talking about, and then strategies for their prevention. How these risks can be prevented and mitigated is what we have to talk about. Now, if we talk about this particular framework of IPCC, we are talking about the interaction of hazard, vulnerability and exposure to assess the climate risk. In general, for any risk assessment, this is what we do. We evaluate the hazards, the vulnerability of the people and the exposure of the populations to this hazard. Together, this defines how severe is the risk, and that is what we are doing in climate risk too. Now, we are talking about majorly 5 risks here under the IPCC umbrella. We are talking about risks to unique and threatened systems. We are talking about the extreme weather events, distribution of these impacts, that how they are distributed, these impacts. So, they might be focused, one type of risk might be focused in certain area, while some might be commonly spread. For example, increasing of temperatures and the risks associated due to heating, they might be globally spread almost equally, while certain events, for example, the cyclones, they might be in certain specific parts of the world. So, distribution of these impacts, global aggregation of the impacts and large scale singular events. For example, a massive tsunami is a large scale singular event which might be triggered and which might be a climate related phenomena. It is one singular event, but it has catastrophic implications. So, this is what IPCC says about identifying and analyzing climate risk. So, when we talk about analyzing this risk, climate risk, we are talking about hazard, vulnerability and exposure. What does hazard mean? Acute and chronic weather climate events. So, the severity of the hazard is what we are talking about here. For example, there is flooding. How severe is the flooding is what will be measured as the hazard of the risk. Then we are talking about exposure. So, across all scales and systems, for example, number of people in the floodplain. So, we are already talking about the severity of the flood. Then we are talking about exposure, how many people are exposed to the floods. For example, in India, we have Kosi river which floods almost every year, but then we know that this is the area in which the Kosi river will shift its course of flow. So, we already are prepared, we alarm people, and while the flood is severe, there are less people who are exposed to that flood because we are better prepared, we move the people in right time, and so the exposure level is reduced. So, the hazard, severity of the hazard is high, but the exposure is low. While in certain areas, in certain cases, it might be that the severity is low, but the exposure is very high. So, people were not prepared and they were caught unaware and a lot of people got exposed to it. The third is vulnerability. How vulnerable is somebody? For example, in the same floodplain, if somebody has a pakka house and a two-storied house, so the flood, due to the flooding, the area might be inundated by around 1.5 meters. For somebody living in a kacha house, in a single storied kacha house, the house might totally get shattered and the person might be in a neck deep water. That population is more vulnerable compared to a person, a family living in a pakka house, where they can go from ground floor to the first floor or second floor and still remain at least protected from the flood water. Even if there is a loss of belongings, there is less of life risk. So, that is the vulnerability that we are talking about, and usually people belonging to lower income groups. So, they do not have adequate shelter, they do not have adequate resources, and whatever minimal resources that they have been able to accumulate is the all that they have. So, they are more vulnerable to a risk. Together all these three, when we bring together, that will give us the severity of the risk, how impacting the risk would be. Now, here we are talking about, if we are talking about exposure and vulnerability, what we can do, and if you remember SDG goal number 13, it talked about two parts. One is the resilience building, strengthening the communities, adaptation. So, as I said that we already are prepared that Kosi will flood every year. So, we move the people, that is adaptation and resilience. We know how it is going to behave, and so we are better prepared. For example, the disaster relief organization, the force that we have prepared. So, in India, almost in every city we have this disaster relief force, and they will take care of the exposed and vulnerable population. So, this is resilience, this is adaptation. So, one side of climate change, climate action for climate change requires building on adaptation and resilience, that will look at, that will respond to the exposure and vulnerability part. On the third side, which is the hazard side, severity of the hazard side, we have to talk about mitigation. How do we reduce flooding? Now, we have developed our cities in such a manner that we have constructed in the extreme low lying areas which were supposed to be left vacant. Now, if we are talking about and then we have cut down all the forest. So, the water which was supposed to get absorbed into the ground due to the plants and fallow land being there, jungles being there, and then the remaining water which was running off was allowed to accumulate in certain water bodies in certain low lying areas. Now, what we have actually done is we have developed, we have cut all our jungles and we have developed all that area. So, that is more likely to flood every year, because there will be more surface runoff, more runoff of the water, and that water will eventually come and get collected in this low lying area, which is now part of the city, which is now developed. So, we are talking about policies here, we are talking about GHG reductions here. So, why would flooding take place? Now, flooding we are taking as only one example. Now, here we are literally looking at all the events, wildfires, hurricanes, cyclones, flooding, flash flooding, we are talking about incessant rains, we are talking about droughts. All these are climate change induced events that are taking place, and they can be mitigated, just like we totally went back, we totally reversed the ozone depletion and we could cover it up. In similar way, we can reverse climate change as well, and that requires adopting mitigation measures such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and one is produce less and two is absorb more by planting more and more trees, make planet greener. So, that is what we are talking about in the hazard part. If you look at the world, this is just a graphic for 2017, just for 1 year, and you can look at the number of events that have happened. So, we are talking about exceptionally heavy rains contributing to deadly landslides. We are talking about 80% of foods insecure people living in hazard prone areas. major bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef, extreme heat waves, floods, major destructions due to successive hurricanes. We are talking about drought and food security related internal displacements, and we are talking about destructive wildfires across the world. So, not no specific area, but I think a lot of areas across the world are witnessing such events. So, this is just one year, a summary of events in 1 year, and continuing with that, we are also noticing that ocean acidification is continuing, sea ice is well below average, sea rise continues, warmest 5 years on record, greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise, warmest year, ocean heat content at record high levels. So, just as we concluded in the previous lecture, the climate change is not slowing down at all. In fact, the graph is only going up and the slope is becoming steeper, unfortunately. Despite having so much of discussion, so much of halagulla about climate change and everything, we are still on the same path, and that is the most unfortunate aspect of it. We are having successful treaties, successful conventions, protocols and frameworks where majority of the world is coming together, and yet on ground action is probably in negative. It's not even zero, it's in negative, and that is why we are seeing this thing. Okay. Now, we come to the different types of climate risk, and here very quickly we will go over the different types of climate risks that people can be exposed to. Now, here what we have generally understood is that this is the risk because of the climate hazards, these severe events that we are looking at. For example, people might be exposed to extreme heat because of the increased temperature or extreme weather events, or crop failures. There could be sometimes be bumper crops also, because there is so much of uncertainty in weather that there could be bumper crops, but at the same time a lot of times we would see crop failures because the temperatures, the weather changes, they are happening, polar cap melting, changes to Earth's ecosystem, epidemics, disruption to the North Atlantic current. So, all of these impacts are expected, but the types of risk, if we classify them, they are way beyond what we think climate risks are. First, which we clearly understand, which all of these which I just talked about can be categorized into, is the physical risk. So, physically tangible, which we can understand, oh, there is so much of heat, there is a heat wave going, flooding is happening, drought is there, there is a stress for crops, there is a reduction in the duration in which the crops would grow, and all of that. These are all physical risks. We understand, in fact, we are largely talking about these physical risks, but there are some more severe and important risks which are transition risks. Now, as we are talking about climate change and the risks because of climate change, we are also realizing that we need to mitigate them. How do we mitigate them? We will have to adopt measures for mitigation. For example, we have to move from conventional sources of fuel for generating electricity to more and more alternative fuels, for example, solar parks. Now, there is a thermal power plant which is already functioning in an area, in a geographic area in some country, and that must have required a lot of capital cost to set up a thermal power plant. But now, due to this climate risk, due to this climate change and a requirement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, what we need to do? We need to abandon the thermal power plant and we need to move to solar power, which requires setting up of large solar farms, funding for that. Now, that is a risk in transition. Will that function? It requires a lot of, so there is an economic cost for it. Whether there will be, now in this period, so the finance, the capital from one particular category will have to be shifted, and this entire shift in funding will have to be only for mitigating the climate risk, for reducing the climate change, and that is what we are talking about. We will have reduced capacity of coal plants because we are wanting to reduce them. The electricity prices might soar because we want to make it pricier. The fuel prices will have to grow. So, we are seeing in our own country here that the fuel prices have been increasing. It is not just because the world has a lower barrel price, it is because we want to encourage people to reduce their dependence on conventional fuel and transportation, use more and more of public transportation and things like that. So, all these are the risks in transition. When we are talking about these risks, we also have to understand that greater responsibility has to lie with the developed countries, because they have, and it has been an agreed concept that whoever eats more pays more. So, whoever has consumed the resources more also has to pay for the price. Now, at one point of time, the developed countries, the industrialized economies, the ones which got industrialized earlier, they were able to consume more resources because of the the machines that they had. The rest of the underdeveloped or developing world was still not consuming resources at that pace. Now, this underdeveloped or developing world has come to a level where they can consume resources, but now two things: one, sometimes the resources are not available; two, even when they can, they are being asked not to do so because the world is already facing severe climate change. We do not want to go for the consumption of alternative fuels. What should be done? So, that is where the higher cost has been put on developed countries, and that is also a transition risk, that is also an economic risk. So, if we look at the climate risks in total, there are physical risks and there are transitional risks. Within that, we can classify them. Physical risks can be classified between acute risks, for example, floods, droughts, storms, or they can be chronic risks. So, acute risks are single event, maybe not just single, but individually each event is the risk that we are talking about, but chronic risks are the generic risks. For example, increase of average temperatures. Now, that is a chronic risk, it is continuously going up and it has severe impacts. So, precipitation changes, sea level increase, these are the chronic risks. If we talk about transitional risks, these are resulting from economic transformation or any change that requires the drastic reduction or elimination of greenhouse gases to achieve a net zero scenario. So, this is the transition risk that we are talking about. They can be political regulatory risks, for example, the price of carbon, the regulation for energy efficiency, fines, litigations. So, all of that is in political and regulatory risks. Technological risk, renewable technology price will decrease. So, earlier the solar panel which would come for price X is now coming at 0.5x. So, there is a risk for the price reduction. We are talking about reputational risks and clients pressure. So, there could be a pressure from clients. So, a lot of companies today are moving towards becoming greener companies, greener corporates. Now, that is a client pressure. So, a lot of times there will be a lot of pressure from the clients, from public, from suppliers, even from employees within the company to reduce the footprint, the carbon footprint, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the overall functioning. There could be market and other risks, for example, connected with a wide spectrum of potential benefits in the value chain, and so you need to do. All these are transitional risks when we decide to move to a net zero scenario. Now, this is largely happening more acutely in case of developed countries and companies which are bigger, multinational companies. For smaller underdeveloped countries, there are more of physical risks and slightly less of transitional risks that we are looking at. So, we are talking about transitional risks resulting or leading to economic risks. Besides these direct physical climate risks, there are also a lot of indirect risks. For example, regulation and litigation risks, which we talked as part of the transitional risks. There are competitive risks. For example, the companies which will not adopt the environment friendly measures or who do not portray their image or work on reducing their carbon footprint, they will be competitively disadvantaged, because there is a growing consensus in the world over which company is greener and to buy products and to adopt their services. Then we may also have the production risks because of the direct physical risks, that the lands may be the resources may be damaged and the production may be halted, or it could also be that the price for the resources will increase significantly. For example, the price for energy might increase significantly. And then we have reputational risks, which we have just covered in the transitional risks. Now, I will quickly take you through some examples of the climate risk. So, one is this global temperature. We have totally departed from the 1981 to 1910 average, which was closer to 0 in 1900, around 1925, and we are constantly moving higher. So, in 2021 we are talking about plus 1.2 degree centigrade is what we are talking about. This is the overall global temperature rise, resulting in rise in sea level. So, sea level, as is anticipated, will rise by 1 feet, between 1 feet to 8 feet by 2100, which is a terrifying number. Again, I say that these are all model predictions. How much of the temperature, global temperature, will affect the glacier melting, the ice melting, and how much of that water is going to reach the sea, how the evaporation levels will be affected, how the rains precipitation levels will be affected. All of that together will give us the exact number, but it is anticipated as on date through various models that the sea level may rise between 1 to 8 feet. The global sea level has increased, we saw in the previous lecture also, by around 0.2 meters, and this is significant. We might be thinking that, oh, it is just 0.2 meters, how much is it? It is not much, but for coastal areas it is a significant rise. Some hundreds of square kilometers, rather thousands of square kilometers of coastal lands has already gotten submerged, and people cannot live there. Houses have gotten submerged, the waves are reaching deeper into the mainland, and that is what sea level rise is pushing people to. Then there is shrinking snow caps. Almost all mountains earlier which had snow at their tops, that cap is significantly reducing, and this is one of the evident risks, and then it risks the entire ecosystem that is around it. We are talking about a long list of extreme weather events. This is just in 2022. We are talking about wildfires, we are talking about famines, floods, unprecedented burning of forests, wildfires that I just said. There is extreme heat wave across the world, specifically in areas which otherwise remained cooler. So, since 2015, I think there has been a lot of discussion around deaths due to heat wave in Europe, the northern part of Europe too, which was significantly cooler, and people were not used to bearing heat, they were not adapted to bearing heat, are now being forced to withstand the heat wave, and that is causing deaths. It is affecting people severely. So, all these are what we are talking about as series of extreme weather events. Again, just for 1 year I am presenting here, but this is like an ongoing thing. Every year we have series of such events, hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons, all of that. Storms, severe devastating storms across, bringing incessant rains, flooding certain areas, uprooting trees, uprooting houses, vehicles, resources, assets. It is devastating. We are talking about cyclones, not just this is just one event that I am mentioning here, but it is happening across the globe. Cyclones, the severity is increasing, the frequency is increasing. So, for all these events, floods, very recently we have seen such devastating, deadly floods in Pakistan, and it has literally displaced more than 33 million people. Floods displacing 33 million people in a small country is a very large number, and out of that the vulnerable population is the worst affected population, and that is what we saw when we were looking at the climate risk, the three parameters together. And not just underdeveloped countries. So, nature does not discriminate, as I said. Flooding in Australia, a large part of the country got flooded. Then there are events such as lightning strikes. The number, the severity as well as the number is increasing. We witnessed a lot of lightning strike events in India in 2022, and there were several deaths due to the lightning strikes here. Wildfires are increasing. Europe witnessed several wildfires. In the mid-August, the wildfire was almost the size of Azerbaijan, an entire country. Look at the amount of precious resource that has been burnt down. Along with it, so much of gases, so much of carbon dioxide and all other greenhouse gases that have been released, so much of land that has been turned into fallow, so much of flora and fauna that has been put on the verge of extinction. We are talking about such events as risks here. Heat waves, we just talked about heat waves in Europe, US, particularly the areas which were used to remaining colder. Typhoons, severe typhoons, powerful typhoons, and preparedness is something that will, so adaptation and resilience is the part where we will reduce the number of deaths, number of lives lost, human lives lost, but we are surely going to lose a lot of assets and a lot of resources to all these events. Then hurricanes, which have become more common. Every now and then we read about news of hurricanes, different hurricanes, snowstorms, hailstorms, incessant flash rains and droughts. So, on one side, in certain parts of the world there is extreme flooding, and on certain other parts of the world there are droughts and famines. So, these are the climate risks that the climate change is going to put us to, and depending upon how well prepared we are, how vulnerable we are, we will be exposed and we will be treated because of these risks. The need is to mitigate this climate change by first making policies and then implementing them, and two is strengthening communities, adapting and becoming more and more resilient. Now, after understanding all these risks, we will quickly see in the next lecture what is the impact of development. We are talking about climate change happening, and we will see some more instances of impact on the environment, on nature, human health, economies due to the so called development. We say it is human development, but the picture and the impact on nature, our own health and well-being does not really give us that clear an idea that we are really developing. So, we will quickly look at that, and then we will move on, because we have now established that greenhouse gases are the ones which need to be significantly reduced. We have to reduce the production of greenhouse gases, and so we will move on to see how the world has come together, how the protocols and others, how they promote the implementation of actions to reduce greenhouse gases, and specifically seeing the mitigating actions. So, thank you very much for joining me in this lecture for this week. Tomorrow we will be seeing, you will be with me for the last lecture of this week 1 of this ongoing course on greenhouse gas emissions, understanding them. So, thank you very much for joining me. See you tomorrow.